Welcome to the State of Cyber War, a production of the Science, Secure, and Mind series of podcasts. Join us as we discuss international cybersecurity policy, information warfare, cyber defense, and how they affect the digital security of the world around us. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the latest in the Cybersecurity Advisors Network's State of Cyber War podcast series. I'm John Salomon. I'm joined again with our colleague and member, Hugo Tarrida. And in today's exciting episode, we are going to discuss the very simple and very straightforward and not at all emotionally charged topic of cybersecurity and cyber warfare in the modern Middle East. And this is obviously a very, very complex area with a huge amount of background, a ton of actors, a lot of conflicting interests. So in preparation for this, Hugo and I exchanged several pages of notes that we've been preparing for this episode. And it became clear fairly rapidly that we're not going to be able to fit this all into one episode. So what we're going to do is we just agreed that we're going to break this down into two parts. In this, the first part, we're going to talk primarily about background, about actors, about general capabilities and structure. And in the second part, we're going to focus on specific actor capabilities, current threat actor groups, and ongoing cyber warfare and cyber attacks, as well as possibly some future predictions. As a reminder, both of us are not experts. Hugo has a degree in I believe it's I keep forgetting it's cybersecurity, cyber warfare. You're gonna correct me. Close enough. And I have a lot of years working in the cybersecurity industry, so consider us reasonably informed amateurs with an interest in the topic and a lot of reading material. Maybe as discussed, let's kick off with a bit of a background of what we think are the main contextual elements of this. And we thought, given the Middle East, traditionally we have this issue of Israel versus the Arab world. And I will recommend for anybody who has an interest in the political background of this, a tremendously good book that was a background for me many, many decades ago at university. I believe it's Mark Tesler, A History of the Middle East Conflict. It's only 600 pages. When you're done with it, it's a great doorstop. And that's obviously something that's currently evolving with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, ongoing Iranian activity in various countries, the Houthi conflict in Yemen. And we're not going to get too closely involved in a lot of these extreme detailed activities and actors, but we're going to aim to give you kind of an overview of who the main suspects are, what some of the motivations are, what some of the capabilities are. And I think as mentioned, so we have a couple of main adversaries who've been in the news, but it does get a little bit more complex, and than what you may see in the daily news. And I think a starting point from my point of view would be to break it down into the general types of capabilities or activities that we see before we go, talking about specific actors. So my initial list, and I'm going to invite Hugo to shout at me and tell me this is really dumb and add anything that I'm missing, was cybercrime. So your classic, bad guys stealing money, taking down services, etc. State-aligned cyber attacks and cyber defense. So everything from national cybersecurity agencies to state sponsored or affiliated cyber criminals. Obviously, there's always a bit of overlap, sometimes a lot of overlap. Hacktivism. And taking down things for political reasons, ideological reasons, etc. Real battlefield cyber warfare, so your classic military command and control capabilities, disruption, jamming, everything directly military related, whether during a shooting war or not. Espionage and disinformation. What am I missing?
Yep, I think it's pretty much most of the general areas, to be honest. I think Keeping in mind the region itself, the main focus, the origins would be more attack and defense. So looking more specifically to Israel and Iran, how they both developed cyber capabilities, it's very interesting how in both cases it's more of a we need to defend ourselves from our enemies rather than we need to develop to be better to attack. This kind of view of we're under threat, we're constantly under threat, under attack, we can be attacked at any moment through different means. For example, made Israel develop their whole cyber structure, whole cyber defense mechanisms and organizations just to provide that defensive ability, which then turned into more aggressive and also more of an attack and be able to carry out operations. Then look into Iran more specifically, it's more or less the same. The fear of more of the enemy of being the US, being Israel, made them more aware of the situation of what they were lacking. And it was in part launched by the Stuxnet attack, which Iran suffered so much from it from the US and Israel. They then developed and started to improve, expand, and actually use very different and specific methods to actually make it possible to have proper cyber defense or what they consider proper to their standards, and also then develop cyber attack capabilities. So I would say those are the main two topics, which then obviously developed into, for example, smaller groups, non-state actors conducting hacktivism, but also, for example, cybercrime, trying to then go more into espionage, more mainly led by the government organization itself, the different departments, different directorates within the government. And then, for example, it's also very curious how Iran is also very big in disinformation within their own population, not only with external actors. They want to have control of the narrative at a more geopolitical level, more regional level. And that also includes their own internal information systems. So looking that way, I think Iran has more more or less different objectives, different means. But nowadays, obviously, since the war in Palestine and Israel started, their attacks has mainly focused in Israel. Israel has mainly focused on, for example, Palestine, Hamas, and then Iran as well. There's a big conflict, mainly cyber going on with different groups, different actors trying to achieve those kind of attacks. So those capabilities are more present nowadays within the war. More, I'd say, also trying to have a larger impact with somewhat less success, because obviously in state of war, countries tend to be more prepared, more ready for counterattacks, defensive mechanisms, rather than something happening sporadically. So that's my opinion. So I'd say it's pretty complete, but a bit of background as well. And also take into account how the conflict is now changing the whole regional perspective on both cyber and traditional warfare itself, how they're trying to combine them and defend, but also attack at the same time in this hybrid style.
I think because we're going to be spending a lot of time on both Iran and Israel, a little bit in this episode and a lot in the next episode, because I think those are kind of the main active, aggressive, and also targeted actors in the region at the moment. You know, even though, as we'll get into shortly, there's a lot more people with their fingers in the pie and with interests who are involved right now. A lot of countries, a lot of groups. Something that you said in one of our previous episodes on China stuck with me, and when I made a comment about Chinese philosophies for cyber attack and cyber defense, and also borders between, you know, quote unquote war and not war, you made a comment which I really thought about for a long time, which is that's a very Western way of looking at things. And I think, especially with an actor like Iran, and we'll see this in a lot more detail, that's something I think that very, very much applies here. Because while on the one hand we have this, you know, I'm a little older than you, so I still grew up with, you know, images of fanatical, you know, Shia and Revolutionary Guards and the Ayatollah Khomeini, and with this idea of, you know, fanatical Shia suicide warriors. At the same time, there is a lot of, you know, reason and fear and national interest and rational interest. But we always have to keep in mind when we're talking about, you know, the Iranians, but also the Israelis, where there's a lot of historical baggage. Obviously, there's a lot of you know, different attitudes towards things like national defense, we have to be very, very careful that we look at all of these topics and these types of activities not just through the lens of your traditional quote unquote Western cyber defender, cybersecurity expert, geopolitical expert, et cetera, but really from what could be their idiosyncratic motivations and motivating factors in developing these capabilities and enacting the way that they do. So I just wanted to add that to your comments just right now.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I will say that obviously Iran having a lot of influence from other actors, mainly like Russia as well, who has this mindset of no difference of peace and war rather than just constantly traveling that gray line. Iran has also adopted and actually used it a lot. Something that's China also very present. But I'm gonna go step forward like further and say that even Israel has been able to adapt that. So Israel has been very, very good at actually adapting traditional Western military tactics and military way of thinking with more Eastern, let's say, way of traveling through that blurred line. And not only that, by combining them. So there's a lot of evidence, like Will can talk about this next episode, of actually Israel using both of like hybrid methods of war. So for example, deactivating missile targets and like the air defense systems and then actually sending troops itself to destroy them physically. That kind of method has been very, very successful for Israel. Something that obviously Iran hasn't been so successful that other countries just maybe because of how large they are, how might they're playing in the geopolitical world, they're not as able to do. Israel has been able to navigate that very well.
But
And
also, if I can quickly, for just on the topic of Israel, again, we'll get into this in a bit more detail. I think those of us who grew up in the Western world, I mean, me in Switzerland, which is probably closer with its military reserve, tradition, even though I was never in the Swiss Army, but generally Western Europe, North America, Australia, places like that have been at peace for the last, well, except for the Americans, but even they have a volunteer army that have not been attacked militarily directly, if I can be very careful with my phrasing, in the past, 60, 70 years, tend to forget maybe that, especially in the case of the Israelis, there is a much different attitude towards the public-private interaction, the reservist mentality, the revolving door between the Israeli Defense Forces and private industry, et cetera. So I think that's also something to keep in mind, just in terms of cultural motivations.
yeah, completely agree. That sense of actually having lived through war or possible constant attacks and threats changes your mindset, and what you're just mentioning
Yeah.
forces you as a country, as an individual as well, to change your perspective, to adapt, to be better prepared to both defend and attack when the time needs and arises too.
So I think this is a good segue into a quick overview of who the actors are and who kind of are the main loci of activity of interest in the Middle East. And what I'd like to do then is continue into a very, very brief history of cyber warfare, cyber attacks in the region as we then ramp up to, I think, what the main attraction is, which is really Israel, Iran, with a few side theaters of interest. So for me, obviously, again, right now, the focus is on Israel and Iran. Israel and Iran, both, they have different levels of cyber capability. Obviously, both extremely well resourced, extremely experienced, extremely capable, different motivations, different systems of government, everything down to religion, socioeconomic situation, allies. But they're not the only ones. And
Yeah,
so when we're dealing with the Middle East, I think the two big, for me, the big non-constantly engaged in cyber warfare state actors, how's that for an elegant description, are are the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and by extension, the broader Gulf Cooperation Council countries. Um,
yeah.
any thoughts on that?
I agree. They're very active. They have different interests, mainly because they're very close to the region itself. They're literally trading partners, economic partners, in some cases even like religiously affined and so on. So obviously they have big interests, but I will also go further and say, for example, Other countries, for example, Turkey, it's also middle player. Also, I will say that it's hard to know where they stand because obviously they have different interests.
Mhm.
So they're obviously helping Israel, but also more or less Iran, depending on the situation, depending on how. So they've always been a more somewhat of a gray character, which is very interesting to actually look
Especially
at.
since Erdogan. I mean, Israel before Erdogan and Netanyahu, Israel and Turkey historically had a very close defense relationship, and at the same time as Erdogan, came into power, the Syrian civil war kicked off, and this goes into the background. But if you want complexity, I still don't have a clear overview on who was fighting whom and who was supporting whom. And all the traditional alliances and all the traditional interests just kind of went head over heels, still are as a result of that, with different groups all of a sudden having conflicting interests to what their traditional interests were. And the
Yeah,
Turks obviously getting pulled into that, not least because a lot of large Turkish firms have significant economic interest in the Gulf, but also because of, for example, the Kurdish situation, which spans, if you'll recall, not only Turkey, but also Syria, Iraq, and Iran.
yeah, completely agree. Also, you just mentioned, for example, Syria. I'd say that's another actor. Obviously, they're more affine to Iran, and they're more mainly focused more internally due to the whole current situation. But also linked to that, for example, Russia, obviously, it's like historic ally of Iran. Russia is that kind of like spirit. I'd say they're always there, but they're not always there. So, for example, that sense, the U.S. is also a historic ally of Israel. Both of them use each other as a proxy, like Russia and the U.S. So I'd say there's many players, obviously some more important, more relevant in terms of.
I would have even said that the KSA, so the Saudis and the Emiratis, are of these, I'd say, second tier active, my refer to my long previous inelegant description, probably the most capable in terms of cyber defense. Their motivation is probably less offensive than like the Israelis or the Iranians, but they do have fairly strong cybersecurity agencies, and their interest is also safeguarding their economic interests. The Saudis particularly had suffered numerous massive attacks, very prominent among the Saudi Aramco in 2015, I think it was, and 2012 and 2021. But also, Iranian groups or Iranian affiliate groups attacking Emirati affiliated interests in the region. So from my own professional experience, working primarily with the Emiratis, the structures tend to be much more public-private in turn, and geared towards defending the national interest rather than what we see, for example, with the Emiratis in the Sudanese civil war or in Yemen, providing kinetic military aid to support their interests. What I want to mention regarding your point about the Russians and the Americans, this is a really good one. That for me was kind of the third major group, and those are the peripheral actors. And obviously, the Russians have very, clear motivations. The Americans as well. The Chinese seem to sometimes be getting involved mainly economically and diplomatically.
Yeah,
But it's worth keeping those in mind, even though they cannot and should not be a focus, in my opinion, of a discussion of Middle Eastern cyber warfare and cybersecurity activities.
yeah, I completely agree. Mainly now because they're not the big players in the region.
Yeah.
Not the big players, but like the important ones, the one making more noise. So obviously something to keep in mind, something mainly for who's supplying who with both tech, weapons, knowledge as well, just information, but they're not actually conducting those kind of attacks themselves, or at least not as
Well,
as we know.
sometimes I've got some for the next
Yeah.
episode. I've got some.
Not at the scale that, for example, other actors are. I completely agree. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, given the overview, and I mean, you can talk about the Bahrainis and the Jordanians and the Omanis, Kuwait, really, definitely. I don't want to be dismissive, but I think in the grand scale of things, except maybe as part of Gulf Cooperation Council collective cybersecurity agreements, not really significant forces to be reckoned with on the cyber warfare front. Same for the Syrians.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we're not going to really go into those, but I think it's a good place to start talking about where have we come from in the last 20 odd years. And probably a good place to start before we start going into this a few specific national capabilities. Big elephant in the room is Stuxnet. You mentioned it,
Yep.
and the follow up, the what were they called? I have it in my notes here. Dooku in 2011 and Dooku 2 in when was Dooku 2 in 2015, targeting, for example, um, systems involved in the Iranian nuclear negotiations in Vienna in 2015. I mean, Stuxnet was really the first, I think, major event. And, we're still arguing about to what degree the Americans were involved, but definitely the Israelis. To jog everybody's memory, that was a very, very technologically sophisticated and cool piece of malware designed at desynchronizing centrifuges, a specific brand of centrifuge used to separate nuclear materials and getting them to throw them off kilter just a teeny amount, just enough to ruin them because they run at such high speeds. And that was actually introduced over an air gap, if I recall. So that was, I think, for most people in my circle and my network, the first real piece of cyber warfare, cyber attack in the Middle East. There's one country, we're used to, for example, the Israelis bombing the Iraqi nuclear reactors at Osirak and American strikes in the region. But this was really the first, for me, example of a state actor, or a prominent cyber attack.
Yep, completely agree. Also, the fact that it was successful and then was spread throughout the news, geopolitical wise, people knew who had conducted the attack, why, and who was suffering from the attack. How also it actually damaged a lot of Iran's not only nuclear power but also whole infrastructure. So it became apparent that they were actually very weak in the cybersphere itself,
Yeah.
technologically, how they were so behind other countries, which is, as I mentioned before, what first started the change in Iran. So they realized how this was actually a danger for them, how it had huge impacts, and how they had to actually reinforce it, change it somehow, and even try to catch up to the rest of the countries.
So
So
kind
I
of at
think,
the base, kind of at the philosophical basis of for example, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps' growth or germination of their cybersecurity capabilities.
yeah, completely. Then they also used a law, which is very, very interesting, of non-state actors, so different organizations which are highly, highly linked to the government, but obviously in that gray area that they don't really work for the government, but they do.
Echoes of Russia.
Yeah, exactly. The same methods. And they've been very successful in trying to attack, trying to do damage. So they've been very active in that sense. So they have done some damage, some very critical damage in some cases, which we can talk about it later on. For example, currently with the war. But obviously, they're still behind. They still know they're behind, but that's why they're wrapping up this cybersphere, but also the military itself. So they now have military division, which is specifically on like cyber, but also have what I was mentioning before, public divisions, which is organization itself, mainly focused to the military aspect. So this is a difference from Israel. Israel has both military and public, like cyber directorates.
Mm-hmm.
Iran has mainly a military one. I'm not completely sure on this, but I am pretty sure that it's mainly military. Obviously, they have some public aspects, but it's focused on military, trying to attack and defend the country itself.
A lot of this is going to be speculation by necessity, you know. But also for me, for Stuxnet, one of the big things that is obvious, this is now, it was often overlooked, was, oh, the Israelis are capable of this. Oh wow, right?
Yeah.
Not just what the Iranians were lacking, but what the Israelis actually had, and that kind of, I think, for me, that kicked off this mentality of really Israel as a cyber offensive superpower, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, completely agree. Like, I mean, in that sense, Israel has been very, very good. So they set up so many different areas of educating people from young, really young ages through like high school, university, even like professional careers focused on cyber, which is something very, very helpful for them because now they have such a big capability and it's very, very powerful. They're, I'd say, unmatched in the region, obviously.
And
The first,
they're very pragmatic about it. I mean, a couple of years
yeah,
ago, I was in Beersheba in the Negev, and with a guy from one of the Israeli ministries, and he told me basically next year, look at this big open field. There will be 5,000 soldiers doing cyber warfare in a building here, and next year there were 5,000 soldiers doing cyber warfare in a building here. I
yeah,
mean,
they're very
that's
practical, but
nuts.
also they're very intelligent on what they have to improve, what their
Yeah.
aim is. So, want to improve in cyber, they're improving in cyber. It's very specific, very to target, and obviously it's paying out its dividends. I mean, they're very active, very good, and also in not only offensive but defensive capabilities. Israel has suffered so many cyber attacks or attempted cyber attacks, and most of them are actually not very efficient or are able to be defended and not cause big damage or even damage itself. So it's paying off in both aggressive and defensive means.
And I think for them, for the Israelis, the cyber attacks, especially on industry, are almost background noise at this point. I mean, if you look at the way the national INCD, the National Cyber Directorate, is structured, with the Israeli CERT being broken down in various sector CERTs, everything from financial services to infrastructure, et cetera, they're very equipped to deal with everything from state actors to state affiliated groups to opportunistic groups. What I find, what I want to go into is kind of the next steps in the evolution in the region, and for me that is a combination of the as I mentioned before, the Saudi Aramco attacks. For the
Mm.
countries that weren't so well equipped, because we'll talk about the Israelis in a bit more detail, um, but also things like DigiNotar, right, where a major certificate issuer was found to be compromised by I believe it was an Iranian actor. I could be mistaken here, and there's something like 300,000 Iranian Gmail users were compromised. It's finally taken down by the Dutch government, but took a while. Um, and we saw this kind of growth. This, the 2010s were also the era of increasingly spectacular major breaches. Saudi Aramco being kind of the first in a long line of massive compromises. Um, and I'm going to put a link in the comments in the descriptions about a series of massive attacks, successful attacks and breaches of Saudi organizations, both government and private. And I think a lot of these I had never even heard of. Right. Um, what I found really interesting was the growth, and to some degree not growth, of um, things like the Syrian Electronic Army, which was not really Syrian government. I think it was more kind of affiliated, possibly Iranian affiliated. Now kind of a spent force, but doing a lot of disruption, a lot of takedowns, especially of more vulnerable, smaller sites in around 2015, 2014. And I think one of the big concerns in the middle of the decade was, I recall after the ISIS, the Daesh attacks in France, there was a lot of worry about ISIS cyber warfare capability, which ultimately turned out to be completely overblown, even though ISIS, their electronic capabilities were primarily focused on propaganda, very slick propaganda videos, and information warfare, and propaganda recruitment. Does that, to you, I think, kind of sum up the 2010s as a background for what we're seeing today?
Yeah, I'd say so. More of a starting point for many countries because suffering from suffering attacks, so they start to actually develop because they know that now they have a problem itself. So I completely agree. I think it's a good background, a good place. There's a lot of evidence also to support that kind of view. So completely agree. There's not much to add in that sense because you already mentioned most of it, more than how it actually developed to now the current situation, how countries are now trying to play either one side or the other or staying more in the middle ground, which is something that's been very effective, might be the word, but very used by many countries. For example, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Arab Emirates as well, trying to stay in the middle ground, try to not make enemies of the region, but at the same time, don't affiliate to one because you might anger the other.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of area, also mentioning what you said before, very focused on defense. So that's also maybe because they don't have yet the strong capability to actually defend and attack at the same time effectively.
Well,
My
especially when you have kind of this multi-dimensional, multi-adversary environment. I refer again to the Turks and the Kurds. And the Turks, they don't like the Israelis that much. They also don't like the Iranians that much, but they both don't really like the Kurds that much. So it gets really, really messy, you know.
yeah,
Uh, Um, what is interesting, and I think going back to what you mentioned before, the Stuxnet as a motivation for the Iranians to kind of get their ass in gear and build some capabilities is particularly using oil rig APT-34 as an example. This is a group that started around 2014, and even though their big attacks I think were fairly prevalent in 2022 or so. And seeing the evolution of this group over those years, and all of a sudden, generally considered to be Iranian government affiliated, to your point from before, what that really means. Are they Quds Force? Are they IRGC? Are they Iranian cyber army, whatever? We don't really know. Again, same as the Russians, the lines tend to blur between, for example, Wagner, IRA, and GRU/FSB. Um, but we have started seeing, I think, the Iranians become much more um, determined and aggressive over, let's say, about the last 5 or 6 years.
yep, completely agree. Both on military aspects, so the actual government itself, or like part of the military group, but also non-state actors, which once again is the blurred line. You don't really know who it is behind, but obviously working for the government or under the telling of the government, because who they target, how they're targeting, and what they're targeting itself. So within a country specific, for example, critical infrastructure, or in a lot of cases just data, and try to get as much information and then just filter out what's important, what's not, what's useful. All of that information attacks per se mainly focus through non-state organizations, while more critical attacks, more trying to put down a server, a whole system, a whole network, tends to be more by the Iranian actual military force. So there's more or less this division on what they're trying to focus, but obviously very blurred because you don't really know, rather than obviously tracking it back, but also what they claim, who they claim it is. Because in the end, although you blame Iran, nothing much is going to happen apart from another cyber attack to Iran, maybe as a response, as retaliation. But Iran's not going to persecute the organizations that are committing it, although they might blame them on it
Yeah.
at international level and so on.
Do you think there is a similar attitude as you have with Russians with criminal cyber actors, which is basically don't mess with Iranian entities, and we may call on you at some point, but in the meantime, as long as you're going after the people we don't like, you're pretty free to do your own thing.
Yeah, completely agree. I'm also, for example, it's a very interesting case. So I'm going to diverge a bit from the topic, just as an example. There was this case that Russian non-state organization actually attacked and took off the power from a whole U.S. Was it town or something like that? I can't
Mhm.
extremely remember right now. And they asked for ransomware, they got the money, and then what actually happened was Russia persecuted this group because Russia didn't actually want that, because they knew they could actually put down the system, blockade, turn the power off in the town, which also meant like within the US itself. And they didn't want that actual vulnerability being known by the US. So they persecuted the criminals who did it. So I think Iran's very similar. Like, okay, you can target these areas because it's something we don't mind. Even if you have information and you can give it to us, we'll be very grateful. We'll let you do what you do, but don't target certain structures, certain countries, maybe because it's in our interest to keep it maybe secret or not involve you at the time. It's a very similar mindset what you're saying, and it's also something that's hard to deal with
It
because
gets
you don't
super
really know.
it gets super interesting though, because with the Chinese, for example, there's generally cons uh, in my experience, there's generally consensus that a lot of their big APT actors are People's Liberation Army affiliated, even though obviously there are a lot of independent Chinese cybercrime gangs. But what you're saying is that that kind of presupposes a level of information flow and coordination between official government or IRGC actors and these kind of shady semi, but not really, but acting in the Iranian government's interests, cybercrime actors that may not exist. So, these guys, I wonder to what degree these guys are kind of, working in the dark, and then they only find out that they've done something stupid when the cops break down the door. We've got about 4 minutes left. I just very, very quickly want to delve into the comparative structures, drastically oversimplified, of the I'd say the main suspects that we're going to talk about in the next episode, the Israelis and the Iranians. So I've dealt mainly with the Israelis, and as you mentioned, the INCD, the National Cyber Directorate, kind of sits at the top of the food chain. They run the Israeli National CERT, which, as discussed, has a bunch of sector certs underneath it. Offensive operations, generally, everybody's heard of Unit 8200 of the Israeli Defense Forces. There's a few other cyber warfare units out there. Every startup, every cybersecurity startup founder and their little dog these days is a Unit 8200 graduate. But obviously there is a huge level of cooperation in the Israeli diaspora around the world, and the commercial community. A lot of these guys also have an emotional interest because they got family back home getting hit by Hamas and Hezbollah rockets. So even when they're not acting in their role as reservists, or they may simply be working as patriotic citizens, feeling that they're doing their part, whether it's in terms of going after hackers or participating in online discourse. Is that a fair summary?
Yep, I agree. For Israel, it's pretty accurate, obviously. On Iran, more they have.
Your turn with the Iranians.
I mean, I know a bit more about Iran because of what I've studied, what I've learned, and so on. But obviously, you're the expert more in Israel.
I am not an expert. I've been there. I know some of the guys. I've done a bunch of Wikipedia reading. So take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, on Iran, it's different, more or less. It's similar structure. So you have the whole Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which has a unit of cyber, which is also called Passive Defense Organization, which is NPDO, which obviously focuses more on defense of Iran itself. But then there's a lot of non-state actors, so different groups who keep forming, who some of them suddenly disappear, and another one comes up, which might be the same people with a different name. This kind of blurred area, you don't really know who is who. So there's a bit difference. Obviously, the intention behind it might be similar in the sense that they want to protect their families back in Iran. But obviously, it's not as strong, I'd say, as Israel, at least not the feeling I have. And more or less it's different structure, but also I'd say different time. So Israel has had much more time to actually create proper cyber structure, different areas divided pretty well, allocate resources, and Iran has been pretty new since the Stuxnet attack, and they're still developing, and that's something you can clearly see.
I think what's also important to keep in mind is the sheer insane complexity of the various foreign groups that the Iranian government maintains, or particularly the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Quds Force maintain contacts with to some degree or another. And I think we should get into some details on that in our next episode. So please join us in a couple of weeks when we talk about everything from particular cyber attacks, malware, Houthis, undersea cables and sharks or Chinese submarines or missiles or whatever chewing on them, and a whole bunch more stuff. What's happening in terms of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, types of malware, how various Western countries are affected by this. And with that, I want to wrap up and thank you very much for joining us. And check the link in description, the link to Cyan in the description for the video. And see you next time.
See ya.
Thanks, Hugo.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in this latest edition of the Secure in Mind podcast series, courtesy of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network/media and /blog for additional episodes and articles. Follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podcast Republic, and iTunes, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Stay safe, stay smart, stay educated, and stay secure.